So welcome everybody. Welcome to this session number 32 of this year GTAP conference. So we have a session on the sustainability issues. We are gonna listen to 3 different papers that touches different issues of the sustainability. So we are listening at the issue related to food waste and loss on our first paper. Agricultural labor supply and environmental sustainability issue on the second one, and then how to capture drivers of SDGs, particularly looking at health and education in the third paper of the session. So it's slightly shorter session than the other, so you might also jump to to listen to a fourth paper once we are done. And well, I guess you more or less know the etiquette for the session. We will give the floor to the presenter. They have 20 minutes. Ginger is very strict with time. And then we'll pass to 10 minutes discussion. You can either pose your question whenever you have question on the chat or raise your hands and I will call you in order. Particularly if we are not too many, I think you can also switch on your mic and camera and pose your question yourself. I don't think I have too much more to say. So the first presenter would be Kirsten Boysen-Urban. She's working at, she's a researcher at the JRC, at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and she will present the work she's done using the global CG magnet on the impact of food waste and loss reduction on sustainability targets. And if nothing against, I think the floor is yours, Kirsten. So your 20 minutes starts right now.
Thanks a lot, Emanuele. I did the mistake. I first shared my screen and then I couldn't turn on my microphone. So let me try again. Do you see my screen?
Almost.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot for this nice introduction, Emanuele. Today, I would like to present joint work with my colleagues, George Philippidis, Robert Ambarek, and Emanuele Ferrari. And this work is on food waste and loss and how much food waste and loss reductions matter for sustainability targets. And oops. Okay, important to state is that the views here are expressed purely those of the authors and not in any circumstances the ones of the European Commission. And the motivation for this work was in the end driven by many different developments that we currently observe. For instance, we observe that food demand is increasing over time, particularly driven by population growth. And at the same time, we observe, for instance, that in some countries we see increasing rates of overconsumption of food, leading to overweight and obesity. And on the other hand side, in other countries, we still observe many people consuming an inadequate diet and still suffer from undernutrition. Or also in countries, we have the double burden of malnutrition, where we observe both developments. In addition, we observe increasing rates of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for climate change. And we face problems with the scarcity of our natural resources, such as land, water, and phosphorus. And if we take all of this into account, then we can say that changing consumer behavior plays an important role with regard to our future sustainability. And one important role could be played by food loss and waste. And for instance, when we look at the impacts of food waste and loss on the environment, then we see, for instance, that we waste in total 1.6 billion tons of food. of which 1.3 would be edible. This is related to a carbon footprint of 3.3 gigatons of CO2 emissions, or 250 cubic kilometers of water use, or 1.4 billion hectares of land. And keeping this in mind and looking at the Sustainable Development Targets of the United Nations, then one of the targets is halving per capita global food waste at retail and consumer levels, and reducing food loss along the supply chain. And this was the starting point for this project. And here our objective is that we want to look at the impact of food waste loss reductions, and we want to look not only on the economic impact, but also the biophysical benefits. And together with food waste and loss, we also aim to have a look at dietary changes and the implementation of fossil energy taxes, because one of these policies or one of these changes cannot tackle the problems on it alone. We use for this exercise a global CGE model called MAGNET. This is the Modular Applied General Equilibrium tool. And this is a recursive dynamic variant of the standard GTAP model. Our model is benchmarked to the version 9 GTAP database in the year 2011. In addition to the standard setup of magnets, we use a bio-based variant that includes many additional bio-based activity splits. For instance, we can consider waste and recycling in detail. This, of course, facilitates the analysis of the circularity of food waste reductions. In addition, this model includes a nutrition module so that we can trace the flow of nutrients from the source of the production to the final consumer, also important if we want to address the nutrition impact. In addition, this magnet model that we use includes a new feature. This is the calculation of footprints. Means that we can determine the average per capita per land use related to household food consumption. And when calculating this, the footprints include account for all inter and intra-industry intermediate input purchases within and between food and non-food production chains, and also the use of our resources. And this also enables us to track, for instance, the flow of non-tradable virtual commodities such as land and water use. And further details are provided in the study of George Philippidis and colleagues. We started our project with a baseline. I don't want to spend too much time on the baseline. This is in the end based on the Global Energy Climate Outlook published by the Joint Research Center. And we project the model to the year 2050 by accounting for detailed assumptions with regard to the macroeconomic development, population growth, changes in fossil prices, etc. And we also account for a detailed treatment of primary agriculture development. In addition to this baseline, we assess here 4 different scenarios. The first one is our initial starting point, food waste and loss reductions until the year 2050. And here we account for the change in food waste and losses until 2030 in order to reach the target of the United Nations. This means we reduce food waste and loss by 50%. From 2030 until 2050, we keep the level of food waste and loss reductions constant. In addition to this first scenario, we assess 3 others. The first one accounts for cost associated with food waste and loss reductions. Here we assume 5%. And again, from 2030 onwards, no further costs are implemented. Our third scenario deals with dietary change. And here we introduce the feasible reference diet as introduced by the Eat Lancet study. Gradually until the year 2050. And our fourth scenario considers food waste and loss reductions together with an increase in fossil fuel prices. And this is stimulated by a 25% increase in a global tax. To come to some details. first, I would like to look at the modeling of food waste and loss. Here it's important that there's no common definition of food waste and losses. We follow here the one from the FAO. And the FAO considers food waste and loss along 5 stages of the supply chain. This means we account for agriculture production losses, we account for post-harvest losses, packaging and processing losses, retail losses, and losses at the consumer level. The FAO, for instance, provides some estimates of food waste that amounts to 100 kilograms per capita per year, and food loss equivalent to 180 kilograms per capita per year. But if you look at the literature, you will find many other estimates. And there was a very interesting study published in the last year by Emiliano Lopez Barrera and Tom Hurdle. And they project food waste into the future, and you can see the numbers here on the slide. Yeah, now the question is, how did we impose the shocks to the model? For instance, with regard to the production side, we introduced food loss as an increase in agriculture, food loss reductions as an increase in agriculture productivity. When we look at the packaging and processing level, those reductions are introduced as an input saving productivity shock. And on the consumer side, or on the consumption side, we introduced also an input saving productivity shock at the retail level, the food service sectors. And in addition, we decreased the expenditure for food commodities and food services at the consumer level. This means they just spend less income, and this way they consume less food. To move on. Also important is how we introduced the dietary changes. I mentioned already that this is based on the Eat Lancet reference diet, published in Willett et al. In 2019. And we introduced these changes from 2020 until 2050. And we assume this way that regions adopt gradually this diet. We introduced the dietary changes by shifting the, reducing the calorific shares of white meat and red meat and dairy consumption, and we increased the share of fish consumption. In addition, we assume that in this scenario, the kilocalories consumed per day are equal to the one in the food waste and loss scenario. Now the question is, why feasible? It's a feasible reference diet because we account for some religious or cultural, typical eating of different countries, and we also accounted for affordability considerations. For instance, when we think about sub-Saharan Africa, then consumers does not consume such a diet, and therefore we just exclude sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, from the meat and dairy consumption reductions. To come to the results, I would like to start with the global impact on GDP. Here we present the results as deviations from the baseline in 2050. And we can see here clearly that the food waste and loss reductions in general lead to an increase in GDP due to efficiency increases, mainly driven by food loss reductions. And we see particularly that this is beneficial for GDP in sub-Saharan Africa. This is, of course, related also to the rather high share of agriculture related to a total GDP. And we see that in most of the countries, for instance, adding the diet reduces the benefits from food waste and loss reductions. Only in case of sub-Saharan Africa, we see that GDP increases a lot. This is driven by a large decrease in prices due to food waste loss reductions and also by huge reductions in meat consumptions. And we see that particularly increasing oil prices has a big impact on Middle East. To come to the impact on agriculture and food production, we see here that due to food waste and loss reductions in most of the regions, agriculture production increases. exceptions are the high-income countries, where we see slight decreases or only slight increases. And we see that when we consider, in addition, cost associated with food waste and loss reductions, then we see that these changes are much smaller. And we see, in addition, that also the dietary changes combined with food waste and loss are beneficial for many of the regions, except for high-income countries with a view on agricultural production. And we see on the right-hand side that there are market price changes driven by these developments that lead to market price changes between 5% and higher than 15% when we look at Middle East. Interesting to have a look is also to have a look at consumption changes. And here we see, for instance, on the bottom, Sub-Saharan Africa, where we can see that Sub-Saharan Africa is excluded from dietary changes, so that we see in the diet scenario that particularly consumption of other food, dairy and white meat is increasing, which would contribute to an improved diet in these regions, while we see in the diet scenario that in all other regions there's a decrease in the consumption of these products. To take the EU as an example, here we can nicely see the impact of the diet, where we see that red meat, white meat and dairy decreases, and to end up with a sufficient amount of kilocalories, horticulture, cereals, and other food tends to increase. We also see that food waste and loss reductions have only a rather minimal impact on the consumption. But important to note is that while food waste and loss reductions lead to a decrease in cereal and horticulture consumption, we observe that the consumption of red meat, white meat, and dairy tends to increase due to a decrease in prices. As I said already, prices change, and here we can nicely see that there's a positive impact on the food price index, so that we can state that all of these developments in the end make the diet cheaper, and thus are beneficial for consumers. On the other hand side, when we look at the social component, then we can see that there are negative impacts with regard to jobs, and particularly affected is the agricultural sector. And here we see the difference between food waste and loss and dietary changes, because for food waste and loss, we see that there's a huge negative impact for the horticulture sector, while when we look at diets, we see that then there are the highest job losses for meat and dairy. To briefly also have a look at the environmental impacts, you see here in these graphs the impact on land emissions and water use. The baseline is presented equal to set equal to 100 in 2050, represented as the light blue line. And you can see here the deviations of the scenarios from the baseline. And with this, we can see that food waste and loss at cost and at oil have only a small positive impact with regard to land and emission use. And we see that when we consider the dietary changes, then there is the big impact that leads to rather high reductions of land use and emissions. But with regard to water, we see a different picture. Here we see that water consumption changes, increases compared to the baseline. And we also can look at the footprints. Here we see the household food consumption emission footprint in 2050 on the left-hand side. And we see on the right-hand side the changes due to the different scenarios. And I think here we can easily say that the impact of food waste and loss and the oil scenario is rather small, and that the highest impact comes from dietary changes, particularly important, for instance, when we look at Latin America or also Middle East and the EU. And we see for Sub-Saharan Africa that there's a slight increase in the emission footprints, driven, of course, by the exclusion from the diet and the increase in food consumption and also meat products due to price developments. And when we look at land use, we see a rather similar picture where we observe that the first three scenarios have a rather similar impact on land use, and that most of the effect is coming from the diet. And this is also reflected with regard to virtue. Yeah?
3 more minutes, thanks.
Okay, then I just briefly tell you that you can see here the impact, and there is a small impact with regard to virtual trade in land. Most interesting is the reduced export of land from Latin America, and we can also see a strong reduction of imported land in the EU in the diet scenario driven by meat consumption, and we observe the same here in the emissions. But I think then I should focus on the caveats of our approach. Important to note is that there is a high degree of uncertainty about the cost associated with reducing food waste and loss reductions. Therefore, we conducted a sensitivity analysis to quantify the impact, and future research will deal particularly with these effects. Also important is that in our baseline, we do not consider the evolution of food waste as a function of wealth, as for instance has been published by Monika Warmer recently. And also important to note is that we fixed the kilocalorie shares from red meat, white meat, and dairy in the baseline. This also affects the impact of the food waste and loss scenario. This means we cannot account for the big changes in diets regarding to food waste and loss. Also, our model is not capable of accounting for household-specific effects with regard to the impact on poverty, etc. And to briefly sum up, I think with our model, we are well suited to account for the three different dimensions of sustainability, and we account for the linkages and feedback mechanisms so that we can trace different impacts if we reduce food waste and loss on the global level. We have seen that the impacts on the consumers are mainly positive, and particularly important is that there are some dietary changes driven by price effects, particularly beneficial, for instance, for Sub-Saharan Africa due to increasing meat consumption. We also saw that the environmental impacts are mainly positive. We saw that land use and emissions are decreasing, but that the biggest impact is coming from food waste and loss. And my final slide just shows that the economic impact of the scenarios is mixed. We saw GDP increases for food waste and loss reductions, but we also have seen that this is turned around a bit by adding dietary changes. And with regard to the socioeconomic impacts, you can say that these effects are the ones that are less desirable, because we saw that employment in the agricultural sector is heavily impacted. We saw huge decreases. And with this, I would like to close my presentation and thank you all very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Kirsten. Virtual applause. The floor is open for question. As I said, in the chat, also please raise your hand. We have the first one. I don't know whether you see the chat or you want me to read it. Great presentation. It's from Sarah Saidada. Great presentation. Could you explain more about the shocks that you used?
Okay, yeah, this is a good question. There was no time to talk about this in detail. I think data is still a problem with regard to food waste and loss reductions. We use data from the FAO based on a report in 2011. And this data provides information on 7 food groups for 7 aggregated regions of the world. And we used this information as a starting point and calculated the shocks in a way that we accounted for the mapping of the FAO data with the magnet database, or the underlying GTAP database. And then we used this as a starting point to determine our 50% reduction of food waste and loss. But future work, I think, will further go in this direction because another unit of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission started developing a database for EU data at member state level, where they try to come up with better or more detailed food waste and loss information, at least at EU level. And then, of course, future research will take this data into account.
Great, thanks. Kristen, you want me to read the question for you? So there's the next one from Tom.
Would be good.
Good, from Tom Ertel. Well, he thanks you for the interesting talk. I agree. Very comprehensive. I noted the decline in employment in horticulture under the food waste reduction scenario. But what if reducing food waste required real resources, for example, workers? Perhaps you could put the laid off production employees to work in the supply chain, addressing the food waste issue.
Let me briefly think. I think this is an interesting starting point because currently we do not account for the effects that there might be different jobs created. And currently we are working on an approach how we can account for these costs better, and also what kind of measures would be appropriate to come up with these changes of food waste. And I think for this, we hope that we would receive better information what would be needed in order to reduce food waste, so that we also might get a better idea of what we could include in addition into the model to not only try to reach the target and have simple ad hoc assumptions about the cost, but to really implement different ways of how we can reduce food waste. And if this be the case that we need additional workforce for reducing food waste at different stages of the supply chain, then this would be one way that we also could consider.
Tom, I see you switched on your camera. Do you want to? Okay, good. So there is another question. Is it possible, from Sarah again, to estimate the effect of trade in food waste and loss by CG model?
So I think with this, if I understand this right, you mean that we account for the food loss or food waste in the end that occurs only while exporting horticulture from one country to another. Is this correct? Did you mean this? Okay. So in the end, of course, this is possible. I think we would need information in order to have an idea how big these effects are. And then we can only focus on the trade flows. Have a look at how much this matters, because currently the data that we use accounts for the different steps from production until final consumption, and they account for the imports that just reach the country. So therefore we assume that all the losses have occurred in the country of origin. But once better information would be available, then of course we would need to adopt our approach to avoid double accounting of food waste. But in principle, this would be possible.
Very good. While waiting for if there are, maybe we have time for another couple of questions. But well, we discussed this already, but I think it's good if you can discuss also here. What about these results on the water footprint? You know, the huge impact that the diet, negative, inverted commas, impact that you get from the diet. Was that expected or that surprise?
I think that's very good that you point this out. I had unfortunately no time to further discuss this. There's a big caveat in our model. We do not account for water with regard to livestock sectors. So therefore, we only consider irrigation water. And in the diet scenario, horticulture consumption should increase, and meat consumption and dairy consumption should decrease. So therefore, we increase the water needed for horticulture production, as a large part of horticulture production is based on irrigated land. And therefore, we see this huge increase of water consumption. But at the same time, we drastically reduce meat consumption, but cannot account for the water savings due to meat consumption reduction. So this is a big caveat, and there needs to be done something in the future.
This comment from Tom, it says that livestock water should be very small compared to irrigation. We have also some figures that we have seen on that.
Yeah, there are some sources that state this effect, but I haven't investigated this further.
Okay. There's one more question. Probably we have time. We have 2 minutes. Otherwise, we start the transition period. Any final words from you, Kirsten?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great comments. I think this is also very helpful to know at which stages I should invest more time. And particularly, I think the idea from Tom of also looking at additional labor forces that we need. So, thanks a lot to everyone.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. That was a very nice presentation and nice discussion. So I think it's thank you very much, Kirsten, and the participants. We can now move to the second presentation. So the second presentation will be delivered by Dr. Shonabashi Rabai. Sorry for the pronunciation. So she will present modeling work. Well, she's currently a postdoc at the GTAP Center. So she plays at home. She will present a work which is a study in agricultural labor supply and the impacts on environmental sustainability policy. So that would be, at least from my point of view, a very interesting overview of on how to model the labor market and presenting. Well, she will give more details on the modeling and on the results. So, well, as in the case of Kirsten, we are on time, so you have your 20 minutes and then we have 10 minutes for discussion as before. I'll shut up and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iman. Can you hear me, I assume?
Sure. Perfect.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Trabushi, and I will be presenting this paper titled Agricultural Labor Supply and the Impact of Environmental Sustainability Policies, conducted with Dr. Hurtle at from GlassNet here at Purdue University. If I can go to the next slide, yeah. So in order to motivate this topic, I want to convince you that we need to focus on labor while we are modeling agriculture, as well as when we are modeling the impact of environmental policies or sustainability policies on agriculture. Labor is an important and very crucial input to agriculture. Its cost share ranges between its cost share ranges between 15 to 60% of cost of production. So because of that, the success of conservation policies, such as retirement of land retiring land to protect biodiversity or restricting extraction of groundwater, the success of such conservation policies relies on the flexibility of the labor market. In a review article in 2016 by Professor Hurtle and others, they have argued that our ability to predict the success of conservation policies really depends on our ability to understand how the labor market responds to these conservation policies. As you can see in the two images on this slide, the interaction between labor and agriculture can be really heterogeneous. There are different types of labor that are employed in agriculture, particularly the three broad types are family labor, hired labor, and migrant labor. Different types of labor are employed in different types of crops across very different regions. So based on that, the way agriculture impacts these three different types of labor is likely to be different. And at the same time, the way these three different types of labor respond to shocks in agriculture or conservation policies is likely to be different. And like I said before, because these people constitute for 15 to 60% of the inputs in the cost of production, we need to better understand the impact of agriculture and different conservation policies on the lives of real people who are carrying out agricultural work. Of course, while agriculture and conservation policies can impact labor market shocks, such as reduced labor availability, for example, due to the ongoing pandemic, can also spill over into agriculture. And in order to better understand that, we need to better understand the interaction between labor and agriculture, the labor markets and agriculture. Labor market shocks and agricultural shocks can also be very localized and therefore lead to very localized adverse outcomes. Previous work by Otter et al., who studied related but different, who studied the trade shocks from China, found that because of sluggish labor market changes, specific regions and specific pockets experienced lower than average wages and higher than average unemployment rates. The same argument can be applied to agriculture. On the left-hand side here, you see the changes in temperature, a map that shows the changes in temperature, and you can see that the impacts can be really localized. So similar to Otter et al.'s work, if agricultural shocks or labor market shocks are highly localized, then while trade can alleviate those adverse impacts to some extent, it is unrealistic to assume that labor can move cross-country. And so there is likely, because of sluggish labor market responses in the agricultural labor market, it is possible that these low wages and high unemployment can also hit agricultural labor. So given that agricultural labor is important to focus in our modeling exercises, there has been limited focus on labor in the literature in the ongoing integrated assessment models. So for example, the GloBiome model does not include agriculture as an input in its does not explicitly include agriculture in its analysis, agricultural labor in its analysis. Other models, the MACPI model and the current version of the simple model, assumes perfect mobility of agriculture. So in response to a shock like this, which could be impacting different pockets, these models assume that agricultural labor can move coast to coast. And intuitively, that is an unrealistic assumption. In addition to anecdotal evidence, a recent review by Hill et al. Contradicts the high elasticity assumption embedded in some of these models. So on the right-hand side here, you see that they find that 1.5 could be the upper limit to the elasticity of agricultural labor. And in fact, in the simulation exercise as well as econometric exercise, they find that the real number for elasticity of agriculture could be even lower, around 0.5 or lower. So as you can see, 1.5 or 0.5, these elasticity estimates are certainly much lower than the perfectly elastic assumption, which implies that there is perfect elasticity of labor. So in this paper builds on recent literature. We build on the recently developed simple G model. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. Other literature published by Ed Taylor and Hill et al., which talks about agricultural labor shortages and other labor market issues. We also build on the discussion on the findings of the China shocks by Otter et al., and we model labor markets and the interaction of labor markets with agriculture, building on the idea of commuting zones. So one of the most important contribution of this work is that it models interaction between environmental policy and labor. It does so at a fine scale. So by modeling labor markets and the agricultural sector at a finer scale, we are able to incorporate local institutions and site-specific agronomic biophysical constraints that underlies the agricultural sector. And the second contribution is that it adopts, by using the simple G model, it adopts a local to local framework, which essentially implies that the model allows local responses to global shocks, as well as feedback effects of those local responses at many different levels. At the finest scale is at the grid level, up to international cross-country or cross-region impacts. So those were the motivation and contribution of this work. Here's a very brief outline of the rest of this talk. I'll use a simple two-input model to highlight why modeling labor markets more realistically by using a simple two-input analytical model. Then I'll describe the simple G model, which I use to conduct this analysis. I'll briefly go over some preliminary results and give you a preview of where this is headed in conclusion. So here are the analytical results. So the analytical model is a simple profit maximization problem with just two inputs and one output. The two inputs are labor and augmented land, which includes land and all other non-labor inputs such as water, fertilizer, capital, and other inputs. The supply elasticity is represented by V, indexed by L for labor and A for augmented land. We assume a CES production function, so sigma is the substitution parameter between labor and augmented land. Theta indexed by A or L is the cost share of either inputs. And this analytical exercise is developed for a natural resource conservation policy. So think about a land retirement for conservation in a CRP program, for example, or limitation on groundwater extraction. So in both cases, it is essentially a supply shock on augmented land on A, so phi A. So using these, I can using the profit maximization problem, I can derive the change in crop supply, the overall change in crop supply in response to a conservation policy, which is a function of all these other parameters and the change in price, lowercase p. So in this table, I just show two equations derived from the profit maximization problem. So the first row shows the change in crop supply in percentage change terms, and the second row shows the land use change in percentage change terms. And the first and I derive these two equations under two different labor market assumptions. The first column shows these results when labor supply is perfectly elastic, and the second column shows these results when labor supply is inelastic. So just to highlight where I get the relationship between columns 1 and 2, in column 1, VL tends to infinity. So in column 2, if you look at these highlighted elements of these equations, which has VL at the denominator. So these highlighted elements tend to 0 as VL tends to infinity. So essentially, as VL tends to infinity, the equations in column 2 collapses to the equations in column 1. So that's the relationship between columns 1 and 2. So the big takeaway from this table is that under perfectly elastic labor supply, we usually overestimate responses to a conservation policy represented by phi A. And why is that? So if you to think about it intuitively, when we assume constant labor, when we assume perfectly elastic labor supply, if there is a shock to the other inputs such as land, such as we retire some land into a CRP program, if farmers in response to the retirement of land want to hire more labor in order to more intensively manage the land that continues to be in production, in doing so, we do not allow any changes in wages. Whereas if we allow changes in wages by modeling labor to be inelastic, there is likely to be a re-optimization where farmers hire a different combination of labor and land in order to minimize costs and maximize profits. So which is why if we assume labor to be perfectly elastic, we do not impose any costs for hiring more labor other than in terms of higher wages. Another thing I want to highlight in these equations is that if you, before, right, and you can, if you look at the land use change equations in the second row, you can see that the substitution behavior does not show up in the first column, because the penalties for substitution between land and labor does not show up when labor is perfectly elastic. So sigma is absent from that column. In the second column, we do have the sigma parameter as well as both the labor supply and land supply elasticities, the ratio of which is important for the response to a conservation policy shock. And the second point I want to make here is that the land use change equation is highly responsive to VA and theta A in the first column, because it is directly proportional to VA and it is just indirectly proportional to theta A. Whereas if you see in column 2, the relationship is more complex. So if we incorrectly assume perfect supply elasticity, then we are imposing a higher responsiveness to these parameters and ignoring the more complex relationships between the land use change and these supply elasticity and cost share parameters. So I use a simple G model for a real world application of this. The simple G model is the simplified international model of agricultural prices, land use, and environment, the gridded version. It is a partial equilibrium trade model which focuses on agricultural production. It adopts a nested CES structure, which includes several inputs: land, labor, fertilizer, and other inputs. It also adopts a gridded framework. So on the top here, you can see a map of one of the parameters that is embedded in the model, and you can see that the map is colored based on grids, which are 5 arc minute by 5 arc minute in size. This gridded approach to this analysis facilitates global to global analysis. So we are able to model local level responses to global shocks. The simulation we conduct here takes into account the population. The simulation we conduct here essentially establishes a baseline for what happens in 2050. And in doing so, we take into account the SSP predictions, SSP2 predictions, and the growth in agricultural productivity from Keith Fugley at USDA. And it is important to take into account these international drivers of crop production, because in the US, because population changes and income changes in other countries, such as developing countries or emerging economies, is higher. So the drivers of US crop production are dominated by international changes in population and income. So here are some of the simulation results. On the left, on the first map here shows the predicted changes in groundwater use in 2050. So as you can see for Western USA, because Western USA is currently anyway highly reliant on irrigated agriculture, further increases in groundwater extraction could lead to groundwater use at rates much higher than the renewal rates of these aquifers and lead to collapse of these underlying aquifers. So we simulate the impact of a groundwater conservation policy that limits the extraction of water in these sort of grids that are highlighted in the second map, where the groundwater extraction is at a rate that is higher than the renewal rates in those grids. So this policy impacts the High Plains Aquifer in Nebraska, Kansas, and Texas, Idaho and Washington, the Columbia River and Snake River Basin, and the Central Valley area in California. So first, I'll present some national level impacts of this policy. Again, here I compared the results of this simulation under 2 labor market assumptions. On the left, the bar on the left shows a more realistic prediction of this policy, where the labor market mobility is restricted. On the right-hand side, we see what happens in contrast, what happens when labor market has perfectly elastic labor movement. So the first graph here is for the changes in crop production. If you compare the blue bars, if you compare the two blue bars, you see that which represents irrigated agriculture, which is directly targeted by this policy. Under perfectly elastic labor, the reduction in irrigated agriculture is overestimated by 100%. So if you compare 2278 and 4554. Once irrigated agriculture is directly targeted, so rain-fed agriculture substitutes for irrigated agriculture in regions that are targeted by this policy. However, if you look at, again, if you compare the orange bars, you see that there is a rise in both cases, but there is, under perfectly mobile labor, the rise is vastly overestimated than a more realistic estimate under restricted labor mobility. Here is the impact on land use. So land use, which is one of the inputs, so the results for land use follows very closely with the changes in overall crop supply. Again, reduction in irrigated land use is vastly overestimated, again, almost by 100%. The substitution with rain-fed agriculture is also overestimated, 27 versus 85,000 hectares. And finally, here is the reduction in groundwater use. Perfectly mobile labor overestimates reduction in groundwater use by 1.5 million cubic meters.
2 minutes, Rabashi.
Okay, thank you. Here is an example of the regional impacts on land use change. So on the left, you see, here is the impact on the regional changes in crop supply change. So on the left, you see the map with the grids that are targeted by this policy. In the middle, you see the change in crop supply. You see a more intensive impact in the Central Valley area, lesser in the Pacific Northwest, and lesser in the high plains area. However, on the right-hand side, you see that there is if we model this with perfect labor mobility, we would be really overestimating the impact, and we would be seeing this impact across country. Here is just a close-up for the Central Valley area. I'll skip this in interest of time. And here is the impact on change in land use. Again, on the left-hand side, you see the map that shows changes in land use under perfect labor mobility. You see that for a shock that are concentrated in some areas spreads to the entire country, whereas on the right-hand side, you see that the responses are limited to the intensive responses are limited to the regions that are targeted, which is more realistic. And here you see the impact on prices. So if we were modeling perfectly elastic labor, then we would be seeing a map that is completely gray. But here we are, by modeling inelastic labor, we are able to see how wages change in response to this shock. So we are able to model the wage change with spatial specificity, and the wage changes varies between -3% and 5%. So here, I'll briefly talk about two extensions of this analysis. The results that I've been presenting has been assuming that labor is only mobile within a grid. A grid is usually smaller than a county, so that is also unrealistic. A labor market, we need to model labor markets better here, and to do that, we will use commuting zones. And here you see a map of the wage changes overlaid with a map of commuting zones. And a commuting zone is essentially a group of counties between which workers travel for work. So it is more realistic that there is instead of each grid being colored by a certain color, each commuting zone is colored by a certain wage impact hit. We also need to model different types of labor: family labor, hired labor, and migrant labor. Until now, it is all clubbed into one specific type of labor. The second extension of this is to model is to better model how production moves. So by including some of Iman's forthcoming work using USDA production regions, which essentially means that if there's a shock in the Central Valley area, it is unlikely to move Central Valley area, which is in the fruitful rim, it is unlikely to move to the Midwest, such as Indiana. Rather, it'll probably move to other regions in the fruitful rim. And here we see that it is likely to move to Florida, southern Texas, parts of the Pacific Northwest. That's all I have. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Sravashi, for the very nice presentation. We're doing it right in time. Well, as before, the floor is open for questions. But may I just ask you a clarification one while waiting for chat? You've mentioned at the end, this issue of commuting zone, and so when in the rest of the paper, when you present the results for the labor rigid, let's say labor, you are assuming that the labor cannot move at all among the different counties. It's sticked. So in a way, you are the two bands. You are probably underestimating the final effects of the shocks. If I understand it correctly, all right.
That's correct. So I think what I'm presenting is two different extremes. And it is, if once I'm able to model labor more accurately, the labor markets more accurately, it might look like something in between the two that I'm presenting. And also when we account for the production regions. So here, in the way it is modeled right now, if there's a shock in California, production can move anywhere in the country, which is again unrealistic. So we are trying to model using some of Iman's work that production in a certain production region stays in the production region and does not move to a different production region, because all regions are not suited for all crop production.
Sure. And you just have one labor type. You don't differentiate between.
Yes, for now there is one labor type, but we will model at least these three different labor types: family, hired, and migrant.
All right. Okay. Well, while waiting for a question, I would have another one, if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
Do you also plan to take into account issues like international migration? I don't know. Is it? I guess is it not irrelevant? No, and particularly in some of the states.
Yeah, I think that is so migrant. So the way we are thinking of dividing the different types of labor is family labor is clear, but hired labor is like domestically hired, and migrant labor would be internationally hired. So in the US, the international labor is really important, especially at least in some regions. So we will be trying to model that as trade between the US and Central America and something like that. It's work in progress.
Emmanuel, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Thanks. Sravashi, thanks very much for the very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm really impressed by all of the work. And my question is quite related to some of my work. Have you thought about incorporating, in addition to those different types of labor you talk, in incorporating seasonality of labor? Is that something that would also be relevant for some regions or some crop producing regions in the US? And if yes, what are the challenges or what would be the pro and the con for including that? Thanks.
Right, that's a very important question, and we are kind of grappling with that. So it would be great if we can. So the underlying data here is in one type of crop. So that is one challenge in order to incorporate seasonality. But for sure, in like fruits and vegetables, seasonality is very important. And we have sometimes labor follows that season. Labor kind of moves from the south to the north or north to the south, whichever it goes. It harvests from the north and moves to the south. It is very challenging, but it would be very useful if we can model it. But we are in the process of making those decisions.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, I see Tom's comment. Seasonality will be highly relevant for migrant labor, which often focuses on follow the crop migration.
You just said that. Great.
Thank you, Ant. Sorry, I didn't see your hand raised. This is why I didn't give you the floor. Sorry, Ant.
No worries,
There is
no worries.
another question from Anna San Juan. In terms of the model metrics, would it be true that labor supply elasticity closer to the southern border would be considerably higher than in the northern area of the US?
I see your intuition. I would maybe. I have not looked at a spatial map for labor elasticity yet. We are maybe in the process of developing that, but maybe Tom has something that he want to add.
Sure. I mean, Sriboshi and I are just learning about agricultural labor really from our work with Ed Taylor, just emerging work with Ed Taylor and Ali. But one thing that Ed has noted is that the mobility of migrant labor within the U.S. has diminished over time. So the typical pattern is, yes, near the border, early harvests, but then they move north. So there's kind of a pool of migrant workers, and then they move across the country. And his hypothesis now, we have to subject that to empirical investigation, is that maybe they won't reach the north in the future, and so the fruit and vegetable farmer in Ohio may not have sufficient labor because of that. So that kind of relates to this supply elasticity question. What is the available labor? So, yeah, go ahead, Sriboshi. Were you going to? Yeah. Kind of same theme. Shortages may emerge. Anyway, we're just starting this. I think it's very exciting work.
Emmanuel, I have a follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Would you mind to introduce yourself? You didn't do it before. So.
Sorry. So I'm Feuerbach from University of Bonn. I'm sorry for not introducing myself. You have done this work for the US. Of course, that's the starting point. Are you planning to? I think Simple G is not just for the US, right? As I remember. So is this? Are there plans to do this for other regions? Because if I think about seasonal labor labor in general in Europe now with the COVID crisis, it's also very interesting to look into that. Thanks.
For sure, why not? But I think the gridded model for the US is best developed for now. The Europe Simple G model, I think it's in the works. Maybe Tom can say something about it. It's certainly not gridded yet, but I think even in the global model, we have Europe as one region or one grid. So we are a little bit away from being able to do that, but for sure, why not?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the concept, the basic model structure is agnostic to what the mapping is from grid cells, from fine grid cells to model units. So this could be Simple G EU or Simple G China, which now exists, Simple G Brazil, which is about to come forth. So we are exploring different regions, and those are places where we have funding. We aren't working on Europe ourselves, but there is Iman, a collaborator on this work. Iman Hatigi does have, maybe presenting elsewhere in this conference, his global gridded version, where he is also thinking about labor in that context. So yeah, we're pretty much obsessed with labor right now and finding ways to pursue it and learn more about it. And we're really at that learning stage right now. Focusing on the US is nice because a lot of work has been done, empirical work has been done in the US that we'll be drawing on, starting with really identifying what is the relevant extent of the labor market because it's not at all clear. I mean, there are commuting zones, but is the migrant labor mobile across commuting zones and within what region? So there are a lot of questions to be addressed, but I think this is a very exciting area to work. And I think we're drawing a lot of inspiration from the trade literature, which has really become sharply focused on labor economics as a key thing. And I think we need to think about it more too.
I'll just quickly respond to Anna. She had a comment in the chat, and Ginger said 2 minutes.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, Anna. Like Tom's been saying, we are learning about labor. I'm not right now aware of grants or aids to agricultural labor, but it's possible. I'll explore that as we take this forward. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you. Thank you. I think we are out of time. Emmanuel?
Yeah, yes, sure. Thank you very much, Shrabashi. That was a very nice presentation. I hope you got interesting comments. I'm sure. And I think it's time now to move to the third paper. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your talk. So as we said at the beginning, the third presenter would be Pilar Gracia de Renteria. She's currently at the Aragon Institute of Agricultural Research, and she will present a paper where she has done an analysis on capturing drivers of social development goals, sustainable development goals, with a particular focus on health and education. Well, without further ado, I will leave to Pilar the floor. I think now it's pretty clear. You have 20 minutes plus 10 discussion after that. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Can you see the presentation? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now yes.
Thank
Now
you.
yes. You can go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes. Go
Yeah.
ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you very much, Emmanuel, for the presentation. And well, I'm going to present this research carried out at the Agri-Food Research and Technology Center of Aragon in Spain, in collaboration with my colleagues Hugo Ferrer, George Philippidis, and Ana Isabel San Juan. So this paper, as Emmanuel said, focuses on the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, that provides global targets to be met in 2030 with relevant metrics for the identification and monitoring of the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. And the use of CGE models for foresight studies is a very useful tool of analysis in this field of study, especially when one considers the SDG trade-offs arising from the interaction of different policy measures. However, the coverage of SDG indicators in CGE models is typically restricted to market-driven indicators, whereas the social dimension indicators remains almost neglected. So the aim of this research is to provide an initial step for improving the social SDG coverage of CGE modeling. And in particular, the objective is to implement econometric models of drivers for health, the SDG number 3, and for education, the SDG number 4. In order to provide parametric inputs for global CGE simulation models. Thus, in a first step, we examine the literature to identify relevant health and education indicators and relevant drivers for each indicator. And then we construct a global panel dataset for our selected drivers and indicators based on different secondary data sources. And finally, we estimate econometric models to determine the magnitude and direction of these drivers across regional groupings. And these elasticities, as I say, can be very useful, can be used as parameters for simulation models. So first, the selection of the indicators to measure the progress of SDG 3 and 4 was based on the Global SDGs Indicator Framework developed by United Nations. And among the proposed indicators, we select 3 indicators to measure the health goals and 2 indicators for the education goals. So for the health indicators, we select first life expectancy at birth, which is a global measure of health conditions. Second, we select the survival ratio for newborns and also for children between 0 and 5 years in order to measure the target 3.2. And third, we also select the fertility rate for women between 15 and 19 years old in order to measure the target 3.7 of the SDGs. And also regarding the education goals, we consider the mean years of schooling for people between 20 and 24 years old, trying to cover the school-age population. And this indicator was considered both for male and for female population, so we can also obtain the gender gap in mean years of schooling, which relates to target 4.5. The data source for all these indicators is the Wittgenstein Human Capital Data Explorer database. And we select this data source because it offers historical data since 1915, but also it offers projections up to 2100. And thus it can serve as a reference for economic simulation models. In this figure, I try to present the geographical pattern for the life expectancy at birth in 2015, and we can observe the existence of correlations across neighboring regions and the presence of spatial clusters of regions with similar values. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa or in Europe or also in Latin America. And here we have a very similar figure, but it's not the life expectancy, but mean years of schooling. And we can observe a very similar geographical pattern than for life expectancy, with clusters, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa or in Europe or even in Latin America. And the same result is also obtained when we map the other indicators. So to confirm this geographical pattern, we have implemented the Moran's-I test that confirmed the existence of global spatial positive autocorrelation with spatial clusters around similar values. So according to that, the results that we obtain in this study are presented for the following 4 clusters: the OECD, Latin America and Caribbean, the Sub-Saharan cluster, and the rest of Africa, Asia and Pacific cluster. And these clusters were formed taking into account the country's proximity and its level of development, but also we have considered the availability of enough observation for the econometric estimations. So once we have selected the SDG targets, an array of drivers need to be considered. And this selection was based in a review of the literature, but also in the availability of relevant variables in CGE models to proxy these drivers through market-based indicators. So the drivers we finally consider are the GDP per capita, also an education variable, which is proxied through the mean years of schooling for the health indicators, and through the share of public education expenditure on GDP for the education indicators. We also consider the share of agricultural sector on GDP as a proxy of rurality, and the daily per capita food consumption. Environmental conditions are also considered and measured through the air pollutants per capita. We also consider the institutional conditions captured by a relative openness index, which is measured as the ratio between the country's share of trade on GDP and the world's share of trade on GDP. And also inequalities are introduced in the model as the Palma ratio, which is constructed as the ratio of the richest 10% of the population's share of gross national income divided by the poorest 40% share. And finally, the per capita GDP variable and the food consumption variable are also introduced in the econometric models in quadratic form when its effect is shown as statistically significant, in order to capture the different effect that these drivers can have for different values of the variable. I mean, for example, when although an increase in food consumption could enhance life expectancy, an excessive caloric intake could reduce it. And in a similar way, the literature maintains that life expectancy rises as income grows, but at a declining rate. So these quadratic variables try to capture this effect. And data for all these variables are drawn for the World Bank Development Indicators database, except for the food consumption that comes from the food balance sheet of FAUSTA database, and the air pollutants information that comes from the air pollutant database from the Joint Research Center. The methodology used in this paper is based on an econometric approach that allows to obtain elasticities to understand the relative strength of each of the drivers that we consider. So a panel data approach with country fixed effects is used to assess the impact of SDG drivers, allowing to measure the relationship between variables, but after controlling for the country heterogeneity. We have information for 149 countries for the period 1990 to 2015. And among the possible model specifications for the continuous indicators, which are life expectancy at birth and mean years of schooling, we use the double logarithmic model because it permits nonlinear relationship between the variables, and because the parameters of the models can be directly interpreted as elasticities. And for the fractional indicators, the percentage indicators, which are the survival ratio and the fertility rate, we use a beta regression model because of its flexibility for modeling continuous dependent variables that are between 0 and 1, and because the prediction of these drivers are limited to the same range, between a range between 0 and 1 also. So now I'm going to present the main results of this paper, and this table presents the elasticities for the life expectancy at birth for all the countries in the sample, and also for the OECD cluster and the sub-Saharan cluster. The results for the other cluster that are Latin America and the rest of Africa, Asia, and Pacific are also in the paper, but I'm not going to present these results them for simplicity. So, as expected, income level and education positively influence life expectancy, and specifically a 1% increase in GDP per capita and in mean years of schooling leads to an increase in life expectancy of 0.21% and 0.16% respectively. And results by region show a greater impact of these variables in sub-Saharan countries than in OECD ones. The results also corroborates the hypothesis regarding the greater accessibility to public services on urban areas than in rural ones. I mean, an increase, a 1% increase in the share of agricultural sector on GDP is shown to reduce life expectancy by 0.21%. And this accessibility effect is more pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa. We also observe that air pollutants per capita has a significant effect, a negative on life expectancy, both at global level and in OECD countries, with elasticities around minus 0.03. But in sub-Saharan Africa countries, the effect is not significant. And the other drivers considered, that are the food consumption, the openness index, and the Palmer ratio, are not statistically significant, although they have the expected sign. Here we have another table with the elasticities for the newborn survival ratio. I'm not going here to present the results for the under 5 survival ratio, but the results are very, very similar to those for newborn. So we see that caloric intake is the main driver of child survival ratio, with an elasticity at global level of 0.14. And this effect is particularly pronounced in sub-Saharan countries, although the impact of this variable is progressively weaker as per capita consumption of calories increases, as you can see by the negative coefficient of the quadratic food variable. The other variables with the next highest impact are education and the share of agricultural sector, which exhibit a similar magnitude but have the opposite sign. And here again we observe higher elasticities in sub-Saharan countries than in OECD ones. There is also a positive relationship between per capita income and child survival ratio, although we can see that this effect is more limited than for other drivers, and moreover this effect tends to be softened as per capita GDP increases, as you can see in the negative coefficient of the quadratic GDP variable. We also observe a negative but weak relationship between inequality and the survival ratio. And finally, the other drivers consider the pollution, the pollutants, and the openness index are not significant. Here we have the results for the adolescent birth rate, and the main driver is education, with an elasticity of minus 0.05. However, you can see that the results by region show that for the OECD countries, the effect is not statistically significant. Rurality is the other factor that has a very relevant impact on the adolescent birth rate, with an elasticity of 0.04. And also the effect of GDP per capita is statistically significant, but again, you can see that this magnitude is limited in comparison with other drivers. And only in sub-Saharan countries do we find an elasticity with a similar magnitude comparable to other drivers. Although also you can see that this effect tends to soften as the income level increases. Finally, the other factors, the openness variable and the Palmer ratio, are not statistically significant at global level, although you can see that globalization has a significant and negative impact on the adolescent birth rate in the OECD countries. And the last indicator for the education SDG is presented in this table, both for female and male population. So A first comparison of the results show that the elasticities obtained for the female population are higher and more significant than for males. And this suggests that the future socioeconomic development will tend to reduce the existing education gender gap. Both for male and female, the main drivers of the education indicator are the share of public education expenditure on GDP and the income level. Although you can see that the latter effect is found to weaken as per capita GDP increases. The share of agriculture on GDP and the per capita food intake also have a positive effect on education at the global level, but at regional level, we observe that the impact of these variables in the OECD countries is not statistically significant. And finally, the other variables, the openness index and the Palmer ratio, unfortunately, have a very limited effect, and the elasticities are usually non-significant at a regional level. So to summarize, this research aimed at assessing the drivers of relevant indicators of health and education SDGs, and the results obtained provide very relevant information about the rationale that guides the evolution of these indicators, both at a global level and for different regions. And the elasticities obtained also are a first step for the integration of education and health indicators into CG simulation models. And now we are working on this issue. In particular, my colleague George Philippidis is working on that, trying to introduce these indicators into in the magnet model. And here it should be considered that here we face the issue of reconciling a partial equilibrium econometric estimation with a CG simulation model complete with its second round feedback effects, etc. So this requires some degree of adjustment of the elasticities that we obtain, because although the parameters are in log terms, the different structural approach that are used means that it is possible that the indicators can be overestimated or underestimated as we move through time. And finally, in this slide, I present a summary of the results. I present the different elasticities for the different indicators and the different regions, but in absolute terms, in order to illustrate two main conclusions of this research. The first conclusion is that the elasticities tend to be higher in sub-Saharan countries, the yellow bar, than in OECD countries, that is the blue bar. So this means that at the margin, the efforts in less developed countries could lead to greater increases in health and education outcomes. And in particular, we observe that the elasticities for the food intake and the share of agricultural sector for sub-Saharan countries are particularly high in comparison with other regions. And this highlights the importance of adequate food and agricultural policies in this continent for ensuring food policy and also food security. And the second conclusion is that besides the significant effect of the GDP per capita on almost all indicators, the impact of other drivers, for example, the education driver or the food intake or the share of agricultural sector on GDP, have a similar or even a higher effect than the income level. However, we also conclude that the impact of pollution, trade openness, and inequality is weaker. And in most cases, we observe that these elasticities are not statistically significant. So with that, I find my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and all your comments and suggestions are very welcome.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you very much. That was again right on time. Now the floor is open for the question, and as usual, I can start. If there is no, well, by the people, I think I can just shoot a quick one. Do you come up with an explanation, or do you have an intuition beside the very low impact of the inequality proxy that you have chosen? That is the Palma ratio on all the drivers you have presented. I mean, is there something you think is behind there, or it's just that it has indeed no effect on the SDGs you have estimated? Well, the estimation.
Yeah, in fact, now we are working on other inequality measures because the Palma ratio is a very useful measure for inequality, but it is also true that we are not looking at the end of the income distribution. Probably we are trying to look at other inequality measures, more focus on poverty measures that put the focus on this end of the income distribution. I don't know if do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, I think
it is a very global measure of inequality, but there are a lot of things that is not covered by this inequality measure. So maybe this is the reason of the non-significant impact of this driver.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, Srabashi, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Pilar. Thank you for the very nice presentation. I was wondering if you did any sensitivity checks for the elasticity estimates. For example, like some of the explanatory variables can be correlated with each other, like GDP with education, GDP with openness. So I was wondering if you looked into any kind of problems of endogeneity and if you did any robustness checks on these.
Yes, of course, we have done this kind of robustness checks, and well, as a first step, of course, when we have the data set, we done an analysis of correlation of variables, and in fact, there are some variables that are usually used in the literature, such as for example, the education expenditure per capita, that we have removed of our analysis because they are very, very, very correlated with GDP per capita, for example. And also we have done some robustness checks, for example, using other variables instead of agricultural share on GDP, but like urban population or other variables that measure a similar indicator or a similar driver. And also we have done some robustness analysis trying to use different time periods, like a more reduced period or a more long period, in order to see if the elasticities change a lot or not when we consider a longer period or a shortened period. And I think that's all, but we have done
that
a lot
sounds
of
great.
Yeah.
That sounds
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you for your answer.
Anybody else? Shrabashi, your hand is still raised. I think it was for the previous question. Pilar, I have another question. I always try to break the ice. Have you also tested a different model for different regions, or the intention is to try to keep as much homogeneous as possible the way in which you treat the regions? There might be, I guess there might be drivers which could be relevant in one cluster and not that much in others, or maybe not.
Yeah. In this study, we use the same indicators and the same drivers for all the regions, because the objective was to compare the different regions, and to compare the different regions, we need to use the same variables in all the cases, because if we use some drivers in one region and other drivers in the other regions, we cannot compare these regions between them. But now we are working more on European SDGs, or the European targets related to SDGs, and there we are using different indicators and drivers, because of course they are not the same targets in high income countries than in less developed one. So yeah, you are right with this comment, of course, and but here in this case the focus was to compare the different regions and to have like a global vision of this SDG drivers.
All right, thank you very much. I guess we have a couple of minutes more.
Yeah.
Ginger? Okay. I don't know, maybe I think, if you want to say something more on the way in which you were thinking how to link this estimation to the model, but I don't, maybe that was that we would have needed George.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I see that George is not in the session, so
let's see. Anna switched on
he's the person that is working on that issue, trying to introduce all these elasticities, all these parameters into the George.
Hey.
Hello.
We cannot hear you.
No.
We cannot hear you, George.
We can hear you.
The mic is on, but we cannot hear you. Nope. Someone can read the lips.
How about now?
Yep.
No.
Lost you again. There was a second we could hear you. And yes, now we can. Yes.
Right. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, I think an interesting part of the validation exercise that Pilar did as well was to try to project forward through time the econometric estimates to see to what extent they corroborated the Wittgenstein projections of the health and education indicators that we chose, and the degree of accuracy was actually I think we all can agree that it was surprisingly good, actually, wasn't it? We were quite surprised how close we managed to approximate. But then when you try to implement these values into magnet, I mean, many of the indicators that Pilar mentions are specific to the magnet model in terms of the nutrition module and the air pollution index, but can be easily included into CG model representations. And when we do introduce these estimates, these parameter estimates, these elasticities into the CG model, we did have a tendency to overshoot the Wittgenstein projection. So clearly, there's, as Pilar I think has mentioned, there's these sort of partial equilibrium elasticity estimates that we're trying to insert into a GE model with its second round, effects, and it's obviously magnifying to some extent some of the outcomes in the model protection. So, one of the tenets, let's say, of this study was that we wanted to get an idea, at least on the relative strength of the drivers for each of the different regions. And in that sense, rather than saying if there are 5 or 6 drivers, let's say there are 5 drivers for a particular indicator, we didn't want to have a 20% weighting. We wanted to have some sort of econometric basis upon which we could do that. So at the moment, the thinking is that we need to have some degree of scaling of the weightings that we've got from the econometrics to put them into the CG model, and then to try to use the Wittgenstein in order to rescale these elasticities to get them close to the results that we need. And another issue, of course, is relating to the education. Obviously, if you start playing around with the education indexes, then if there's a higher degree of people getting smarter, countries are getting smarter, then it affects the degree of skilled labour in the model. So to what extent does it feed into the skilled labour endowment, and how does that impact on wages and GDP and so on and so forth? These are following steps which we haven't even started to tackle yet. But there are many structural implications which are aligned with some of these SDGs. So at the moment, it's more a case of trying to generate plausible, replicable results from magnet, and then maybe in the next step we can start thinking about how it might impact on the more structural elements of the model.
Very good. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Giorgio. Well, I think with this, unless there are any other questions or hand raised, which I don't see, I think the session can be considered over. Thank you very much to the 3 presenters and all the people that attended the session. I think it was very, very interesting. We had very nice and relevant presentations. And as I said at the beginning, if there is still one presentation around in the other session, if you want to join it, or see you virtually tomorrow for the last day. Thank you a lot, Ginger, for hosting us. Thank you again, Kirsten, Pilar, and Shrabashi for the nice presentation. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy your time wherever you are.